Good to see you. And we are live. Hello, everyone who is joining us. Thank you for tuning in to another exciting live stream that we're going to be doing. Today, I have Nik Egor, who is the field CDO over at Dremio, and we'll be talking about building strong relationships with business stakeholders, especially as that pertains to data leaders and how they can build that sort of empathy and understanding within the organization. To kick us off, Nik, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and especially tell us about the role? Field CDO sounds like you're playing relationship builder on both sides of the of both internally and externally and helping your customers build those relationships. So can you tell us a little bit more about your role?
Sure, and you might have defined it even better than me in less words. So my name's Nik. I think for most of the folks on the phone, the easiest way to think about it is I've mostly lived on the other side of the table as a customer or a prospect for most, on the vendor side. So I've run data analytics platforms globally for major companies like Nike, Zendesk, American Eagle, Philips, Concur, and I started my career working at the National Security Agency. So things like security are always at my heart. I'd say I switched out about almost 2 years ago now, somewhere around there, and I became the chief data officer over at Okera, who had recently sold to Databricks. And prior to going back on the other side, I decided to give it one more shot. Did not really want to go to Databricks. And I reached out to Dremio, and we basically created this role over here for me. So the field CDO, really at the end of the day, I travel almost every single week to major customers and major prospects of Dremio. And I spent about 30% of that time talking about Dremio. And what I'm really doing is helping them think about like their data analytics architecture and strategy, but really tying that to business value. I always like to say nobody funds architecture. So transformation really happens at the people level and organizational impact and data culture. So really helping companies make those ties where then technology kind of invisible underneath the covers allows folks to scale. So it's really just taking all those different levers and really helping our customers build out their own strategy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when I think about the market and how long the term data-driven organizations, and now I think recently we call it data-informed organizations, have been a concept, it makes sense that that's a required role. How do I fit Dremio? How do I fit any sort of tool into my overall strategy, and how is this going to help my business? We were just talking about it right before the show. That's one of my favorite parts of my job as well. I get to talk to our customers, tell them sort of what's your data strategy, what's your journey, what's the next year look like, and how does Big I fit into that? How can we help you get from A to B? And a lot of those conversations rely around bringing the business closer into the data, making the data useful for the business, making sure that the right people are getting the right information at the right time. And so when I talk about business stakeholders, I often think about the C-suite, the VPs, the ones who are consuming the data to make some sort of informed decision. And they are the ones who need to be convinced that this is a valid investment. You need a data platform, you need a data strategy to make you successful as a C-suite or as a business decision maker. Is that similar to what you've seen?
Yeah, it's actually even funny. It's even my journey with Dremio. I actually reached out to Dremio before I was about to take another position with a competitor. And I told him, I was like, honestly, I think your tech's better, but I think you're missing it. I was like, you're missing the real opportunity out there, because the reason why I reached out is, I was one of the early adopters before kind of even data mesh was a thing and building out a lot of those capabilities. And one thing I just always anchored on is what I call like the unified access tier, a single location to access their data, regardless of where it's at. And just, again, making it much simpler to shop and consume data as a customer and driving that transformation and pulling folks out of individual systems. And when I reached out to Dremio's main message heavily was on the acceleration side, right? And making SQL run faster. And as you'll even see now in our messaging, we're now a unified lakehouse platform for self-service analytics. So really just, taking those lessons learned in the field, bringing them back in, and even help us evolve our strategy of, it's, you can serve 20, 25 power users in a company, or you can serve 2,500 and make those 2,500 power users, right? So I think that's the part where I get excited, is like, how do you really bring the business in instead of constantly looking at a space where nobody has enough engineers, nobody has enough analysts.
Yeah, and that's something that going from that tech focused sale to that business focused sale, I think is particularly valuable, but is also very difficult because it is targeting a different kind of market. And at the end of the day, Dremio, Big Eye, we're technology companies,
Yeah.
but we have to build that abstraction layer on top of it to say, and this is how we're providing the value, and you don't worry what's underneath. What's your take on exposing the what's underneath? Because I feel like that's often a easy to explain to the engineering team, much harder to explain to the business as to why one solution versus another, because the names are all the same in the marketing.
Yeah, I got a couple of fun stories. I guess I'll spread them out throughout the call, and then, instead of burning them all now. But maybe I'll start with one. Is, when I joined, I'll just say one company. I normally do my tour around and go, hey, do you know what we provide on data analytics capabilities, right? What are you missing? And I remember very clearly one of the leaders at the company within the APAC region, and they were doing massive, they ran the sales organization down there. And he was like, you know what? The number one skill I have to hire for is not folks that understand the customers, not folks that understand our technology, nothing. The number one skill I have to hire for is SQL. He's like, I can't hire the best people in the world to do what we do because I have to hire for SQL first. I wish it was just easier to work with the data and to allow the insights to allow us to make better decisions. Find me a way not even to work with SQL, let alone Python and Java and everything else in the world. So I think the business craves not caring. What the business really wants is to be able to get the insights they need to make better decisions. So if you can serve that in a way that's non-technical, I think more often than not, you'll see massive adoption.
And I feel like the common model, the adopted model, and I'd love to hear from our listeners to see if this resonates with them, is you have lines of business and you have verticals, and they have a set of analysts attached to them. And the analysts are that human bridge between the technology and the business. And they're the ones who are talking to the stakeholders to understand what they want. And then they're talking to the data engineers to understand, well, how is this even represented in underneath it all? When I was at Uber, we were the central data warehouse team, but a lot of my work was with these lines of business teams. I talked to Uber Eats, and Uber Eats had embedded analysts, and they had their own set of data engineers. And they said, well, here's our data model, and this is how we think about the world. And our analysts are talking to their PMs to understand how the world works. But then they have to translate that back to the data engineering team and say, well, this is the tables we want to represent them. These are the dashboards we're going to build. And it sounds like you're talking about this panacea of let's cut all the human labor out of it and really just connect business directly to the answers that they want. How far away do you think we are from that realistically?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time we're much closer than we give ourselves credit for. I think we focus on maybe the wrong questions at times. And so when I built a couple of data product teams in the past, one of my favorite examples even in here is I was American Eagle. Mm-hmm. And we had over 100 dashboards in one particular business unit. And when you got really down into the grains and so forth, you ride along with your business unit owners and the digital teams. At the end of the day, there's only 5 to 10 questions they keep asking, right? And it's just how do we sell more jeans today? Did we sell enough jeans today, right? Did people buy more jeans when they bought other things? And when you strip it down there, we got down to about 10 key dashboards for that business area, and one of them was only 6 data elements in one dashboard. It's not as complex when you go backwards and say, what problem am I trying to solve? And I think that's the part where it's well, what data model do you need to serve this? What kind of analytics would you like to see? No. How can I help you answer that question faster?
Yeah. I think I feel like that's where that communication breakdown happens a lot, though, is because as a data engineer, as somebody on the practitioner side from most of my career, I think about things in terms of databases and tables and pipelines, and I am getting the data to you, and this is obviously useful. But then the part that has always been missing is that, all right, the data is there, but nobody knows how to use it. Nobody knows how to access it. And that building that relationship, building that communication of here are the words that the business is going to use to describe what they want. The business is going to say, I just want to know how many jeans I sold, right?
Yeah.
But then the data engineer is going to hear, well, okay, well, where's the gene data coming from? Are we have to pull it from our sales?
They don't
POS?
care. They just want to know that the data they're reading is trusted.
Exactly.
Right? Whether that hits 4 or 5 systems, whether it's updated near real time to real time, they're not making decisions real time in most of these cases either, right?
Yeah.
They're just like, how do I improve selling more jeans, right?
Right.
How do I make sure that we don't put crop tops on the website again? Because we should never have put crop tops out there. Nobody was even searching for it, right? And
Yeah.
I think to the comment that was even put in here, it's like being able to even bring the data to them and the insights to them to help them answer questions they weren't even considering. Like that's a true partnership.
Right. Yeah. And going to your point, Eduardo asked, do data teams ever express to stakeholders suggestions in terms of prioritizing business objectives, and how's that received? I think that's that ultimate middle ground. Is once you understand the business's perspective enough, you can come and prioritize it for them. But the relationship needs to be there. You have to already be at a place where the business trusts you to make a suggestion. What I've noticed a lot, and I even experienced this myself, is engineering teams will focus on the value that the technology can provide without fully understanding why that value is important. And then that it becomes a much more difficult conversation with the business, because the business says, well, what am I getting out of this? My needs are actually not, you're not even talking the same language as I am. And once you get to that same language, once you're talking about not pipelines and POS systems and tables, once you get into the language of, all right, you have stores and stores sell jeans and there are customers that buy those jeans, then the business is going to be much more receptive to nudges and recommendations on this is how we can go about meeting your needs and meeting your business objectives, because you're going to be talking their language.
Yeah, and I can't attribute this next comment for a good reason, but I had a CMO once tell me when I first met with him, and I asked him, I was like, well, you know, how are you thinking about even the problem? And about 45 minutes into the conversation, he just paused and was like, look, the how we're going to do this is going to matter. He's like, I can't fire everybody on Monday. And they're going to keep asking you to pull copper and to pull wires and set up landlines. And he's like, I need you to show up with a cell phone. And sometimes you're going to have to teach them how to use it. And at other times, we're going to have to keep phones in certain buildings and cell phones in other people's hands. And he's like, it's going to be hard for some. It's going to be easier for others. So like how you prioritize where even you do those relationships matter. And at times too, being humble enough not to, to show up the right way. Because in another company, as part of even our financial forecast model, we walked in there and said, this doesn't look right. And we built a whole nother model with additional data sets in about 2 weeks. And the model clearly showed we're never going to hit the numbers that we project to in the next 3 to 5 years that we've even been reporting out into the street. And it was right, but that was delivered the wrong way. Like that's got to be done in partnership. So even in times where the trust isn't there and you have those insights, sometimes you have to still build that trust, even though the insight's the right thing to do. Like that's where real transformation happens versus innovation.
Yeah. And I think that's 100% a trust problem. You can't, if you're never going to have a good conversation if the first thing you do is you go to some business leader and say, you are wrong about everything you've been doing.
Well, let me show you why.
I feel like this is why engineering gets a bad rap, because it's all fact-based and just rather than value-based and trust-based. And that's where it becomes tricky to bridge.
Oh yeah, as I said, I have too many actual stories that are anecdotes. I had an actual CEO once tell me, he's like, I don't care what the data says. It looks right, but I don't like the way it makes me feel, so I'm not going to listen to it. And I'm like, this is why storytelling and partnerships matter so much.
And this is something that I've always found interesting, going back to that communication piece, is the data analysts have historically been the ones who are doing that proactive trust building and communication with the business. And so, as you said, Nick, I agree. I think we're edging closer and closer to where the business can go directly to the technology and start asking questions. I've seen some really cool demos out there of LLMs within BI tools that leverage a lot of semantic layer technology and a lot of other annotations and tagging, but allow you to go in and say, build me a report of my gene sales by store for the last year, month by month. And it will take that and it will break that down, build the right SQL, generate the right visualization. Now, I'm sure it can't do anything that's a little bit more detailed and nuanced than that because that requires the relationship. And so my question then becomes, who is then in charge of that nuanced relationship? Because is that really just up leveling the data analytics teams and turning them truly into business insight teams where they say the technology is now no longer the limiting factor? You don't have to hire for SQL, you have to hire for business acumen and translating that down to what is important.
Yeah, it's actually a very maybe unintentionally amazing question, because even in your example, you noted store. When I was at American Eagle, we had 3 different definitions of store. When I was at Zendesk, it was hard to actually say what was sales yesterday because everything had an asterisk on it, right? So I think what we're going to probably see in the next year or two, as we really start scaling out LLMs and Gen AI and so forth, is that massive need for governance and quality data. And not even in terms of the hallucination problem that we're seeing in some of the data, but just even to your point is, how would it know what sources to go look for when I said, what was sales yesterday in North America, right? Or like, what does our contract look like with ESPN? Well, ESPN as its individual, ESPN as a roll up with ABC, ESPN with Disney and ABC, like, so things like all that foundational data and maturity still needs to be there, which is where I think some companies are getting it right, where it's like, look, we can point to the particular data sources and we need to make sure we're mature in that. So we can only point at gold sources, for example. But again, still governing and maturing that ecosystem is important. But all that the business still doesn't care about, right? The business still wants to just ask in natural language the question. So it's really imperative to the data team to go, hey, we kind of have our moment here to actually agnosticate the underlying source, but we still need to mature it, right? It doesn't mean that we can still go crazy.
Yeah, I think that's probably a really good indicator of where maybe data strategies are going to go in the next couple of years. I've been really closely following semantic layer and the whole notion of how do you describe your data in a way that makes it easy for you to navigate it, search it, ask questions of LLMs because they are trained on your semantic layer. And so is this really where the turning point where data strategy moves from infrastructure strategy? What database am I using? Am I on Snowflake? Am I on Databricks? Am I using dbt? Am I using Matillion? There's a million questions out there that you need to answer at an infrastructure level. But are we, with the advent of AI and semantic layer and a lot of this tooling on top of the data infrastructure, are we getting just closer and closer to a world where data strategy becomes much more closely aligned to business strategy and just say, how do we better serve the business faster?
I mean, it really has to. And I think if, again, kind of working backwards is there was a good article that came out recently, Harvard Business Review article. I think Randy Breen and team kind of sponsored this one. And one of the things in there I just absolutely anchored on was a note that like CDOs with a business connection spend on average $5 million less to reach the same revenue goals as those that don't. Right? Because it's like, we're not focusing on how to run pipelines better. We're not focusing on trying out new tech. You're actually applying it directly to a business priority, right? Yeah. Getting those shared OKRs. I've always had my product teams, for example, like every single thing that we build and we work on, we don't count. We only count the impact we make to the business. Right? And that needs to feed back into that OKR process. So I just think it's imperative of it's got to be connected.
Have you seen a good example of a business connection for a data team? Because I believe the number. I believe that you can achieve your revenue goals faster if you have a business connection. Have you seen that work in practice, and what are some tips that you've seen that might help other teams?
Yeah, the last the last 3-ish places I've been, dating back to even to Nike, as we kind of moving to like these mesh type of architectures and frameworks, is building out those data product teams, right? So for me, I've generally looked at product managers 3 different ways from a data product perspective. One is just a core platform, right? You got to have that trusted underlying data, and having a product owner, for example, of Big Eye or Dremio. But then you have that product owner that's in that business side, right? Is to think about what dashboards are we building, what models are we building, and treating like some of those top 10 dashboards as an actual product, right? And maturing them and thinking about them intentionally, connecting them to that gold level data. The same thing about building out our data science models, right? Most of those models classically kind of get delivered and get ignored to the next model.
Yeah.
We're like really thinking about maturing them, because things like LTV and next best message and so forth, all those require constant dynamic taxonomy is addressing them. Oh, and then there's that third space, which I'd say is probably ignored a little bit when done right, which is that innovation space. Having those 1 or 2 things of like, what can we actually deliver as an innovation arm of the business as a result of data. And I think being able to have a small chunk of that to be able to go, hey, we're also a revenue generating. I think that's important.
Yeah. And Ava is asking, how do you count the impact of the data team? I think measuring data team impact is notoriously difficult. And I think this is what, Nik, you're alluding to, is having those shared OKRs, making sure that the data team is aligning with the business and making sure that what is the business goal? If the business's goal is sell more jeans, then the impact of the data team will be, well, how do we help you sell more jeans? What information do you need to sell more jeans? Maybe how do we automate restocking of jeans if you keep selling out of them? Maybe we can, that's a project for the data team to automate that process. And what I've noticed a lot is that innovation bucket that you talked about, Nik, is oftentimes prioritized over other things, because as engineers, as technologists, we like to think about step change, and we like to think about what's interesting and innovative. And oftentimes that comes at the expense of, well, there is a 2-week solution to this. Like if I go and like write a little script and I run it on a schedule, and this is going to save the business $1 million or make $1 million, a lot of times that gets overlooked because that's not considered interesting. And I think that's something that we as a data culture, as a data society can, as a data community, can start changing our perspective on. It's not about the technology. It's not about the stepwise innovation. It's about having tools in your toolkit and using them to make business impact, and then using that to then say, this is what the data team is doing for the business.
No, 100%. And there's also that hard part of it is you got to realize, even though being an innovation arm and essential, like in a data organization, that means it still has to go into the business. So maintaining a very clear relationship, whether that's a product team or even an in-function business team, success for this thing isn't living in your organization. Success for this really is being able to hand that off, and that has a continuous life cycle, living on past you, so you can continue to work on the next things. Right. And I think a lot of times, like, there's a pride factor in there too, right? It's like, I built this really cool, innovative thing, right, that's driving so much more revenue for our business, or I built this really cool model that's delivering this next best experience to our customers. I want to continue to build on that. You can, but guess what? There's somebody that owns that relationship every single day.
Right.
Right. So partnering with them early or pulling them in early enough, how do you impact their day? Right. And that's part of like even the value stream mapping, right? It's like, if I can take, an in-function, merchandising person that could never do something to now being able to do something in 5 minutes that would have been infinity, that's great. But taking something that materially is measured and says it takes them 3 weeks to do this thing that I just made it happen in 1 minute, like that materially changes your business.
Yep.
So I'd say being able to measure that is, and internally is just as important as what can we do now tomorrow that we couldn't do today.
And I think that's a lot of time we talk about time to value, and especially as vendors. I mean, Nik, at the end of the day, your job is sell Dremio, my job is sell Big Eye. This is as data tools, as in the vendors in the data space, our job is measured on time to value. How quickly can I get up and running? How quickly can I show value with this new tool? But internally, it's exactly the same thing. When we were at Uber, best time to value for us was actually, you take a query that is being run by 1,000 analysts, like 5 times a week each, and you materialize that into a table, and you update that table every 2 hours. And from a time to value perspective, it was everyone's getting changes at the same time. We're cleaning up the data, we're monitoring. No one has to rewrite their queries every time the underlying data model changes. And from a business perspective, saves the business thousands of hours. But the time it took us to get there was a few days. Like, it took us a few days to just get all the data, build the pipeline, done. And
most companies still take quarters to do that, by the way. So it was still cool that you did that in a few days.
Uber circa 2015, the data team was it was phenomenal. The pace with which we moved, which we had to move, was amazing. But that is still something that is, again, much shorter time to value, rather than us saying, well, we can make these queries run faster. Let's bring in new data warehousing technology. Let's teach the analysts how to build their own pipelines. That's not going to bring that same amount of value. It will bring eventually the same amount of value over a much longer period of time. And so I think that's another way of measuring your impact, is not just how much value you're bringing in, but how quickly can you get there.
Well, I think this is the part of like bringing that product model in, right? Because if you told me, hey, there's this new technology that can help me go from weeks, months, or even quarters to days, and folks can self-service, like, that sounds really cool. Where would that ever get tied to an OKR at the business, right? Now, if I said differently, hey, if we need to change our strategy on how we're offering or even making changes to our UI, and that UI impact is going to change how we serve the next best product recommendation to a customer, right? Mm-hmm. If I say we can make changes if you learn something in days, right? If I go to a meeting and you say, what would happen if we wanted to test this? I say, we can do it tomorrow. Right. That gets funded. Yeah. I think that's the part of the language, like on the tech side, it's like teaching yourself to speak in business terms will get you funded all day long, but it forces you to be able to also go, how do I measure the impact of this in business terms? Because do you even make those decisions every day? Or is it made on a Monday morning, once a week? Right? So I think those are the pieces where, like, how do you make that real for the business? Because at the end of the day, they have your funding.
I think we've talked a lot about how data teams can work with the business stakeholders. I think there's also a darker corollary to this, which is oftentimes the business thinks that they want specific things from the data team without actually understanding the implications or the complexities of it, or maybe even not even sometimes understanding why it matters. I have a great example here. When streaming was just taking off, and it was the next real-time data was the next best thing. There are a lot of efforts to build real-time analytics and real-time dashboards and things that are updating every 5 minutes and every 15 minutes. And the biggest challenge I've had with that, and I have taken the stance multiple times in public, so this is not a hot take for me anymore, that real-time analytics is very rarely necessary. And there are very few real business use cases aside from vanity metrics where real-time analytics is useful, because the decision-making cycle of a business is much longer than 15 minutes. It's longer than the refresh cycle on your data. And that is something that I've done a lot of time pushing back on and discussing and trying to align on requirements. Why does this have to be at a certain rate? Why does it have to be a specific data set? Does it have to update on a certain time schedule? And how do you see data teams successfully do that, Nick? How do you push back on the business and say, look, we understand that you think you want this, but actually you want this other thing? And it's not about prioritizing their work. It's about saying the outcome is going to look slightly different than you envision in your head, but you'll get the same business outcome.
Yeah, I think as a data team, we often think in like functional and non-functional requirements and break into like a full detailed architectural spec. And maybe my favorite example is I think I can probably talk about this one. When I was over at Nike, right, and we were trying to build out like a connected product strategy as part of like a supply chain of the future thing, right? So where we can actually track inventory all the way from initial idea to the warehouse building it, all the way through delivery. And even doing cool stuff like I want to scan my shoe and possibly win a meeting with LeBron James, after even a purchase, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about that whole flow, just in that middle part on connected product, I think it was like a 50+ page requirement deck from the architecture team with the in-function engineering team of the business of like, I need 99.97 uptime. I need real-time inventory eventing as part of every hop. And we need a deployment in EMEA as much as we need in US, and we need to run hot. And I just kind of sat back and I'm like, nothing you said has anything to do with the business. And I challenged the whole thing. And I kind of put my badge on it. I was like, I think we just need to have a conversation and just say, hey, if I missed a hop, for example, from it getting off the plane, going into the truck, and then a truck going into a factory, as long as I hit the factory, does that make a difference? Well, no, we can't miss 2 hops. Okay, so you need a maybe once delivery. Great. And that also kills the real-time insight requirement. I just pulled you in 9 months. I was like, cool. Is there a performance requirement that you actually going to make a material decision based on when the data hits? Oh, no, but we need to make sure the data is there. Great. I can get rid of the EMEA requirement. Right now I can just run out of West. And I just pulled in another 3 months, and now we're probably saving up somewhere around $6 to $9 million. I was like, and you keep working your way down, and you're just like, well, guess what? We can probably deliver this thing in 6 to 9 months in an MVP cycle and actually test this thing out in market, and we can start going after fraud, right? As one key material, business level of impact, which is now, obviously, as you know, many millions of hours to Nike in the black market. So cool. As we then continue to firm this up, it's always that fun adage of like how fast, how much is it going to cost, and how quick to prove value. You keep anchoring on that, especially the value piece. Nothing I talked about was I didn't say, do you need a maybe once delivery, at least once delivery, only once delivery? Do you need a near real time? Can I event? How much is my retention? Like, the business doesn't care about any of that. So making that shift, it's hard for data people, right? Because you always think in functional, non-functional units, but like deliver the need.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of, as a product team, when you go to somebody, when you go to a customer, and they're telling you requirements, technical requirements and functional requirements, the easiest way to solve that problem is to say, what are you trying to accomplish? And then once they start describing that, then you can reverse engineer okay, well, this is actually what you want rather than what you think you want.
Yeah, no, the metadata catalog we built over there, when I joined Nike, it was so far behind schedule. And the requirements were crazy. And I'm like, well, what do we have now? They're like, well, we have glue, and it's pretty shaky, and it goes down like twice a month, and we don't really know why. And I'm like, well, if I can deliver you the same performance of that, I was like, is that okay? They're like, sure. I was like, you just threw out 2/3 of my requirements, right? So again, it's just like being able to get on that level makes your life so much easier. But also makes the business life easier because it gets them into a flow of not asking for technical things. Like, don't come and ask me for Kafka. Come and tell me that you need to be able to see, inventory, and a near real-time view of inventory to make these types of decisions. Great. I got 5 platforms I can deliver that for.
Yeah. And I think this is tying into Adriana's question over here. What are some of the biggest mistakes we see data leaders make when trying to collaborate with stakeholders? And I would consider what we just talked about, the technical, coming in with the technical rather than with the business, as a communication gap. I think would be my 2-second summary of that. Is like, if you're not speaking the same language, if you're not speaking about the same things, and you're misunderstanding the terms or the ideas or the concepts, then you're just not going to have a productive conversation. And I think a lot of time the onus is on the technical person to understand what the business person, the non-technical stakeholder, is trying to express, and then mapping that back to the technical, rather than trying to get the business stakeholder to understand the technical and map it to the business. And so I always consider that just a communication gap, using the same words and using the same concepts and making sure you both agree on what those words and concepts mean.
You always want to, like, when you say that,
What is a word?
that without that word. Yeah. If I can yes and to what you're saying, I think it's that space between understanding the mission and empathy, right? And I've had really good conversations even with tech teams. They're like, well, why is that customer still on Oracle? Right? Or I go in there, how do we get the supply chain team out of SAP? And I'm like, do you think they want to be in there? Right? Like, what they care about is delivering a customer experience. What they care about is having confidence and knowing what's in between the four walls, right? What they care about is for a SaaS company that I'm not going to create unintended friction that creates a churn signal. Like, those are the things they care about. So when you come in and say, and I fell on my face really hard early on in my career, and I learned this lesson on the mission side. If you come in without having empathy and understanding of the mission and why they're doing what they're doing, like that, you're always starting out on the wrong foot, and you're going to have a very short relationship and a short lifetime in there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then this kind of ties into going into the nitty gritty. Actually, let's say you agree on what you're building, why you're building it, why it matters. And I don't think it ends there. I think the communication still continues throughout the whole project lifecycle, well, going back to your example of the glue catalog. Okay, can I just make glue more performant? I think you still need to keep that communication up as like, are we still experiencing the same challenges a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later? When is good enough? Did we misunderstand each other in a previous conversation? Now we're implementing things the wrong way. I think that a lot of times it's easy to say, well, I'm done talking to the business stakeholders. Once I get my requirements, I'm just going to go off and build. But it's actually important to not just go off and build, but check back in periodically and say, are we still building the right thing? Is this still what you want? Is this still a priority for you? Because business priorities, I feel like, shift a lot faster than technical priorities do. And keeping that aligned and making sure everyone's on the same page over time is also important.
Well, I think this is why I've always prioritized that platform team of product too, and kind of separate it from the analytic and data science kind of side of it, which is, if you're building the right foundation, the business priorities can change. Right? If I want to think about running a distributed architecture and how do I do that without being stuck in proprietary systems and so forth, it's like, well, what does that mean to the business? What I'm actually building is a faster way to move into customer 360 implementations, right? And if we do it this way, I can shift into our messaging system, right? So I can do a next best message. I can also shift into supply chain and do next best product recommendations, right? And I can also shift into product itself and go, what's the next best thing we should even be building based on trends and how we're thinking about our the dynamic taxonomy of our changing customer base. Like, whatever priority we shift into the business, I've built modularly enough that I can pivot in and continue to deliver fast. And I think that's the part where if you pull them out of the tech a little bit, if you're building the right way, it's easier to be a good partner to them to say, sure, if we want to switch to next best message to next best product, great. It's a different data set. I can go pull that in the same way I'm still executing this currently. And if we want to come back, it's already foundational.
Yeah.
We might be able to experiment already with both.
Yeah. And I think I agree 100% with you. I will warn our listeners of a mistake that I have made multiple times in my career now that I have learned from, which is over-optimizing for the future. Thinking that I know what patterns are going to come up and trying to predict the business use cases and predict the product functionality. And it makes the original implementation overscoped. This is why I like to talk so much about time to value, is at the end of the day, do it a few times in a maybe not super scalable and sustainable way, but you will find that pattern faster than you would if you tried to preempt it ahead of time. And so that is a warning that that's a lesson I've learned the hard way multiple times.
No, this is why I say, like, build incrementally to that state, right? Like, everybody moves towards a North Star. You're going to take on debt, right? As much as you might not want to, but that's where it goes back to, like, again, how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? How fast to deliver? Deliver fast, right? And build incrementally. So if you have to take those pivots, again, the pivots are more on the use cases, not necessarily the architecture. but you've built modularly and open enough that you can take those changes. One of the fun things I usually tell when I'm speaking at events for Dremio is, what the cool thing about working with Dremio is if you want to rip it out in 7 years, it shouldn't take you 10 years to rip it out, right? Like we're not building proprietary. Like that's not a thing you should look for in companies anymore, right? And even though some platforms may say open, like good luck ever taking your code base out of them if you've had that experience.
Yeah, I think there's no such thing as an easy migration ever, but I do think that it's possible to build something that is easier to migrate.
Well, 2 years, not 10.
2 years, not 10.
Right? Because like you're just moving to logic at that point. You're not changing everything, and that's hard.
I feel like, as a slight tangent, we as a SQL, as much as we say, oh, SQL is a standard and it's all ANSI, and let's be real, there's no such thing as standard SQL, and every database migration project always takes years because it's, well, 80% of this translates directly and we can copy paste this code, and the rest of it is custom functions and proprietary, and we're rebuilding everything in the new environment. And so I think this is where even we as technologists are like, oh, but if we build an open standard, then everyone will comply to the open standard, meets the harsh realities of proprietary software still rules most ecosystems.
That's just like a customer telling you they have a standardized connector.
Generic.
Like, I haven't seen two companies do the same Kubernetes deployments, even when a push button. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that is very true. And I want to kind of go back to a little bit on attention, using the same words, using the same terms and the same concepts. You mentioned a great example. What do stores mean? What do genes mean? Well, I guess hopefully genes mean the same thing everywhere, but who knows? I think that's something that a lot of teams struggle with today, is standardizing on definitions and metrics. And when it comes to data, a lot of what we talk about are those business metrics. What is, back at Uber, what is a trip? Well, Uber also had, I think, a handful of definitions of trips. There's a driver trip, rider shared trip, eats trip. Yeah. There's a lot of...
and I'm sure they were the same on every system that was consuming trips.
Definitely. Definitely have the same. But that is also something that I feel becomes a headwind for a lot of these efforts, is when you are talking to the business, it matters which line of business you're talking to. And it matters who you're talking to. For example, if I was talking to the Uber Eats team and we were talking about trips, I knew exactly what they meant by trip. And that was not at all the same thing that is meant by rideshare. And that is something that I think I realized pretty quickly, where the word might mean the same thing, but the definition and the implication of it is very different. And that's something that I found very important. And that's why I think metric catalog has actually died off as a concept, but is still massively important for large organizations.
Yeah, no, I speak probably at too much length sometimes on data catalogs in general, because I get a little fussy when people are like, oh, what's your data catalog? I'm like, for what? Right? Because you have your metadata catalog, you have your business terms and glossary, and you also have generally that space where people shop for data as a data catalog. And they can be 3 different things. And even how you're doing pub subbing and a bidirectional relationship between your catalogs, right? Because, and my favorite example is like if somebody's doing something in Dremio, right, and interacting with data that's in S3, but that data is also being consumed by Snowflake as part of a marketplace, right? But then someone's also interacting directly in S3 at the bucket level. Well, when changes happen to that or enrichments happen, what does that mean? Like, and how do you manage the flow of that? Like, what's the source of truth? Yep. So, like, this is where I get in fussy fights sometimes with our customers. I usually make it easy when I go, cool, if you want to standardize on Unity Catalog and Databricks, for example, is every single data element and every interaction going to PubSub back into Unity? It's like, no, absolutely not. They're like, well, then neither one of us should be your enterprise catalog, right? But we should talk about facts and how we define facts and the path to being a fact in the business. And who owns that fact?
Yeah. Ownership, I think, is also massively underrated here, because it's not just about aligning on the terms. It's about on who is allowed to even define that term. Who is the ultimate person who says, this is what that term is and every other definition is wrong. And catalogs, I feel like, give you a false sense of security because you can see the words on a page, but then who actually put the words on the page becomes a different conversation.
And I would say there should always be a business owner and a technical owner. And my number one recommendation is, like, if you're even starting with this, start in finance. There's always a very clear person that owns the metrics on your K10, right? Someone owns what revenue is. So being able to make sure, like, how do I capture that? How do I make sure when changes happen in Salesforce all the way upstream? Yeah, there's somebody that actually owns the downstream impact of that. And starting there is much easier than starting at things like who owns trips when 6 parts of the organization do.
Yeah, right? Yeah, definitely. Adrian asked another great question. What advice can we give for working with stakeholders who are resistant to change or are difficult to collaborate with? I think it boils down going back to empathy. Going back to what Nick said, why is that stakeholder resistant to change or difficult to collaborate with? Maybe they just haven't had a good experience with a data team. Maybe they've had requests that have just gone completely ignored for a long time, and they're saying, well, data team never gives me anything, so why should I work with them? And so starting from zero, building that trust up, building that empathy, understanding where are they coming from, what do they need, and think small incremental progress will make small differences in their life, and they will learn to love the data team, appreciate the data team, and then be more open about their needs. I think that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, what's really fun, Adrian, is I have one slide that I have used now for the past 8 years across about 5 different companies. It is the same slide. I just changed the company name in it. And it's pretty simple, where it's just kind of on the top of it, it talks about like the technology transformation, right? People want to move to data-driven. They want to move to event-based, decisions and, algorithmic, intelligence. But then there's the bottom part, which is the people, right? Being a primary landing house for analytics and like everybody still wants that same stuff. The technology part is so much easier, right? Who wants to run cubes anymore in a contemporary architecture environment? People know how much of a headache it is updating cubes. People know how brittle cubes are, right? But that still runs so much part of the world and so many parts of the businesses. And it's like, well, how do I get them to change that? How do I get those changes, patterns? And my example I'm giving is actually a major company in the US that I actually had this exact conversation with. They're like, we're worried about driving more adoption because the teams are resistant to change because they're so used to and are comfortable with cubes. And I'm like, it's the transformation part of this and the culture part that matters so much, not the technology stuff. You can sit down with them, run through the new architecture, like, absolutely, it makes complete sense. But guess what? I'm running cubes tomorrow to answer all my business questions. Right? So bringing them along is massively important. And I'll tell you, every organization I've been in and then I advised to, it's a slightly different answer. The data culture in that organization matters. The maturity of analytics in those organizations matter. How mature they are thinking about and talking about the business matters. But I will tell you, the one thing everybody can always anchor on is mission. So if you can connect it into how this would impact their day-to-day, that matters. Yeah. Like, some people are motivated by that, and that's where I think we all have some kind of common thread together. Other folks are motivated by trying new stuff, right? Other people are motivated by making more money and having more opportunities and getting out of that company because they may want to go on to do bigger things in their mind. So it's really connecting with and understanding how people tick, and then helping assure how you can drive that transformation in not just that person, but then that team and then that organization. It's definitely a people up to technology path.
Yeah. I agree with that, and I think a big part of that is. Did my video freeze?
No, I got you, Igor. Your video's paused, but I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Something's going on. I'm not sure what happened with my video, but I agree with that, and I think part of that is people get used to their workflows, and they don't want to think about new workflows and think about how to change, just because it's hard to break from a habit. If you've been doing the same thing for years and years and years, you have to be really convinced that the new way is going to be better for you. And that is going back to it, is teaching that person, teaching that team, and building that understanding of this is why this will be better for you.
Yeah, and like back to the empathy, it may not actually be resistance. They know this runs the business today, and I think there's a level of like maturity on our side advising them, which is like, why would they make that change knowing that any of those changes could impact their workflows, their customer, and like, so there's a risk profile that has to be addressed there. So that's what I say. I think how we show up absolutely matters. All right, you will be right back. But if there's any questions and comments, I'm happy to go back and forth with the audience here. All right, maybe I'll give you one more fun story while we're sitting back. So I speak a lot about data mesh. It's obviously even core to Dremio's value proposition in market. Back to meeting the business where they're at. One of my fun stories here is I was actually talking to an E-suite, E-staff leader in the company I was working at, and we were pitching them running a centralized versus a decentralized model, talking about data mesh and so forth. And the person, which I love and I'll take it with me forever, he just looked at it and says, "I don't care." He goes, "I'm like a mushroom." And he's like, I'm kept in the dark all day. I'm fed, we'll just say excrement. And every time I grow, I get cut down again. And then I get bigger numbers to be able to go meet again. Can you help me solve that problem? Right. And I think when you think about how we deliver to the business, they really don't care at the end of the day. What they're caring about is how do they keep growing? So I think when you talk about things like data mesh and fabric and centralized and virtualization and all that jazz, again, connecting it into what does that mean for delivering value for them faster and helping them grow their business? That's why these trends are picking up so much speed in the market and continuing to mature up. All right, Igor, I was sharing another story while you're gone.
I love it. You are a wealth of stories. I think the amount of stories just completely crashed my Chrome, and
there's a lot of pain behind those stories, though.
A lot of pain, yeah. But it's either that or my 100 open tabs that I never end up closing.
There you go. No worries.
One or the other. Awesome. I know we got about 7 minutes left. Happy to answer any questions. I'm gonna try to bring us home. We've talked a lot about the human side of this. We talk a lot about the empathy building, about mutual vocabulary, about how to interact with these stakeholders. I think what we've sort of where we can leave this for our data community is, all right, so now we're doing all this successfully. We're engaging our stakeholders. We're talking to them. We're bringing into the process. We're aligning our OKRs. We're working on the same things. All right, how do we then communicate that back out? We're successful at this. What does success mean? How do we talk about joint success rather than this is just success of the business doing business things?
Yeah, so this is where I'd say as a platform team or as a data team, I've always focused on let's say the last couple of years, really the marketing side of it, right? I never talked about how many dashboards we built. What we talk about is, hey, here's the impact we've made in the business, back to those OKRs, right? Here's what's possible. And as we've even built out the foundation, I'd have those product managers and product teams and even the engineering teams. I used to go into any engineering team and say, if I can talk to one of the engineers and they can't tell me the impact their work's going to make, I will shut it down and I'll put my own badge on it because I'm accountable for that in extreme ownership. Right? So I think the piece here is every single thing we're doing is really should be foundational to the next things we should do. Right? People always talk about Legos, but in my mind, like Legos are really about continuing to deliver, right? And building and building and building and building upon. So if you tear it down, it's easy to continue to build other places and other pieces without having to start all over. And I think that's the cool part when I think about like the architectural history, when you think, through where data architecture is continuing to mature out. It's how is that continues to be a foundational model or foundational pattern for what could be next?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, but
a little bit. And then you get to business outcomes faster. And we've come full circle to time to value, getting there faster using what we built on and iterating on top of that. Yeah. That's awesome. Happy to wrap this up. Looks like there's a very great question. How do we follow up on this? Any resources, communities that we can recommend for conversations like this? I've personally found that a lot of these happen in like these small little podcasts and webinars and live streams. My personal favorite is the Joe Reese podcast. I think he has two of them. He has his own podcast, and then he has one with Matt. But he oftentimes I have exactly these same conversations with Joe, and he has them with other data leaders. So I would definitely tune into his stuff for more conversations like this. Nik, is there anywhere you go?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I go to dramatically different places depending on what I'm looking for. And I think, back to a Joe Reese, like the influencers are out there in those spaces. Like if I want, it's kind of a homer answer. Like if I want to learn about open, I look at Alex Merced, who's actually an influencer over at Dremio, but talks about the whole space. If I'm looking at, just general data quality and some of those places, there's a couple people I follow there, data contracts, right? Yeah. So I more so go like, there's particular people that are just amazing at the spaces that they're in, and their content's always just so good because you get a lot of these kind of stories that go, when I go in and talk to a customer, it's not like, look what we could do. It's, hey, look what Coca-Cola is doing, right? And it makes it so much easier to make things real. Right. I know I've kind of talked my way around the answer, but I'd say is, find some of those influencers and find some of those people, following them, and then the things that they frankly even like. That's how I found even more people.
Yeah. And I think to your point, a lot of people talk about the topics that they're interested in. Obviously, we do data quality and data observability. We talk a lot about quality and connecting that back to the business. And that's a topic that I'm a big fan of. Everyone has their topic. You will find the topics that you enjoy, and you will find the people around those topics.
Yeah, I definitely say anchor on some influencers and then play off of their space. And then you'll find a nice tree of, they're very small communities out there.
And data is a very small community. You will eventually, that tree will circle back on itself, and there's no longer. Yeah.
You'll find Igor and me again at some point.
We'll come full circle. Yeah. Well, awesome. Nik, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thanks a lot for the conversation. This was excellent. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We will send out a link with the recording afterwards, and there will be a link to a blog post that outlines a lot of these topics as well. And if you're interested in checking out Big Eye, feel free to message me on LinkedIn or visit us at bigeye.com. And we'll also attach Nik's contact information so you can reach out to him as well.
Awesome. And thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks, Nik.